Chapter 1. The Mark of Hopelessness. From his earliest years, he carried a weight that seemed invisible to everyone else, yet pressed on him more heavily than any illness. His body had betrayed him more than once, dragging him through childhood fevers, fainting spells, and long stays in sterile hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and echoed with hushed voices. Doctors spoke in cautious tones, always uncertain whether he would bounce back or decline again. His family listened to those medical updates with a kind of detached resignation, as if each setback confirmed something they had already decided long ago. In their eyes, he was not a son or a brother who fought for health, but a fragile burden marked by weakness. At home, he grew familiar with the subtle signals of dismissal. Averted eyes when he entered a room, sighs that seemed heavier than the silence itself, and the faint pause in conversations that resumed only after he left. He was present, yet perpetually overlooked. Whenever he attempted to share a small triumph, a day without pain, a paper completed on time, or a shift worked without exhaustion, the response was rarely more than a nod, sometimes nothing at all. Over time, those muted reactions carved into him deeper wounds than the needles and procedures he endured in hospitals. They etched into his mind the belief that his value could never surpass his shortcomings. His father, a man of rigid expectations, never raised his voice in anger, but carried a cold certainty in his words. He spoke to relatives and neighbors about his other children with pride. Yet when the subject turned to him, the phrases became clipped, careful, and dismissive. Through walls and half-closed doors, he heard the verdict repeated in a tone that carried finality. "He's a lost cause." The phrase echoed in his memory long after the sound faded. It was never shouted. It didn't need to be. Whispered judgment carried further than cruelty shouted aloud, seeping into every corner of his self-image. His mother expressed her resignation differently. She carried it in the long exhalations when she believed no one noticed, in the weariness of her glance that avoided meeting his eyes, and in the way she busied herself with tasks rather than face his presence. Her hands, once gentle during childhood fevers, grew colder with each passing year, retreating into distance rather than care. His sister, too young at first to grasp the layers of disappointment, learned quickly to look away when he struggled. Her silence became another confirmation of what he already knew. His existence brought discomfort, not pride. Yet he fought. He studied when fatigue begged him to stop. He worked when his body urged him to rest. He grasped at every ordinary milestone, knowing that for him, nothing ordinary came easily. Each step was proof that he was not defined solely by frailty. He endured ridicule at school, where classmates noticed his absence as much as his pale face, and he pressed on regardless. Deep within, he cultivated a stubbornness that was his only shield against the sense of inevitability surrounding him. But no matter how hard he tried, the phrase clung to him. Lost cause. It became a mark he could not wash off, a scar carved not by injury but by repetition. At times he would sit alone, replaying his efforts, counting each success, only to find them swallowed by the emptiness of his family's disbelief. Their words, even unspoken, had the power to hollow victories into nothing. It was not illness that suffocated him most. It was the absence of hope reflected back at him from those who should have been his anchor. As he moved into adulthood, the cycle continued. He earned enough to live, yet the achievements were met with silence. He joined projects, completed responsibilities, yet the acknowledgement never arrived. Birthdays passed with obligatory gestures rather than celebration, and family gatherings became quiet stages where he played the role of the overlooked. Each year layered more resignation onto him, and though he still tried to rise, his family's narrative pressed him down with invisible hands. To them, he was already gone, even as he stood breathing before them. The moment of collapse came without warning. He had learned to live in a fragile equilibrium, pacing his strength, concealing exhaustion. But that day, His heart betrayed him with a suddenness that mirrored the words he had heard his entire life. Darkness surged, and sound slipped away, but before consciousness broke completely, one final impression struck him: the atmosphere around him. He had seen it before in their faces, felt it in their voices. It was not panic, not desperation to keep him alive, but the cold certainty of people watching an outcome they had long expected. In that split second, the phrase returned, not as memory, but as reality, surrounding him like a final decree. He's a lost cause. It echoed without sound, sealing the air around him. His lungs refused to draw breath, his chest refused to rise, and yet he felt it more than any physical pain. The weight of those words pressed harder than his failing heart. In that moment, as the world blurred and faded, he understood that the greatest wound of his life had not been illness nor weakness, but the quiet, merciless judgment of the very people whose love was meant to sustain him. And as he drifted into stillness, that mark, the mark of hopelessness, remained etched deeper than ever, branding him not by fate alone, but by the family who had chosen to believe he was already gone. Chapter 2. The moment of darkness. The collapse came without warning. One moment he was seated at the table, his thoughts drifting between ordinary concerns and the dull ache in his chest that had become so familiar. And the next the world shifted violently. It began as a sudden tightening, a sensation that squeezed the breath from his lungs and robbed his body of its rhythm. Then everything dissolved into a rushing void, a sensation of being pulled backward into an endless tunnel where sound and sight fractured into fragments. His arms went limp, his head fell forward, and within seconds the space around him blurred into an indistinct haze. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor rang in his fading awareness, followed by the hurried shuffle of feet. Voices rose, sharp and frantic, though not infused with the terror one might expect. They spoke quickly, words tangled together, yet beneath them he detected an undertone of inevitability. It was as if the scene had already been rehearsed in their minds, as if the possibility of this very moment had long since been accepted as his fate. Someone's hand clutched a phone, the tone of dialing piercing the atmosphere, but the act seemed less desperate and more procedural. Their movements carried the stiffness of obligation rather than urgency. It was not the fierce determination of loved ones fighting to hold on to him, but rather the practiced gesture of those eager to pass responsibility elsewhere. The phone became their shield against guilt, a way to declare later that they had done what was necessary. He felt this realization pressing against the thin edges of his dimming consciousness. He could sense faces leaning over him, shadows that blocked the light above. Their features, though blurred by his failing vision, carried no spark of raw fear. There was no trembling in their hands as they hovered above him, no trembling voices calling his name as if to pull him back. Instead, there was a quiet resignation, a heaviness that weighed more than panic. They were not fighting for him. They were watching the end unfold, already adjusting themselves to the certainty of his absence. His hearing, though faint, picked up the sound of one of them sighing, a breath that carried the resignation of someone who had lost the will to resist. Another shifted uncomfortably, muttering in a tone that sounded more like irritation than grief. He tried to grasp the fragments of their words, but the void tugged harder at him, pulling him away from the physical world. He wanted to resist, to prove that he was not yet gone, but his body betrayed him, refusing to obey. The minutes stretched, though in his state they became impossible to measure. His sense of time fractured. Darkness and blurred impressions merged into one, as though he floated between two worlds, no longer fully anchored to either. His limbs felt weightless, disconnected from his will. Yet somewhere in the haze, he felt the cold surface of the floor beneath him, grounding him just enough to remind him that he had not vanished completely. Then the sound of a door bursting open shattered the stale atmosphere. Boots struck the floor with firm, practiced steps, and the room filled with new energy. A rush of movement surrounded him, Voices commanding, purposeful, alive with urgency. He felt pressure on his chest, rhythmic and unrelenting, forcing life back into his body. Air was pushed into his lungs, harsh and foreign, yet tethering him to existence. The void still pulled, but against it now was another force, determined, insistent, unwilling to surrender. Through the fog of his fading awareness, he caught pieces of speech, clinical terms, counts, instructions exchanged with calm authority. These voices did not carry the weight of resignation, but the conviction of people who refused to accept that the fight was already lost. Their hands pressed against his body with the steadiness of training, their presence breaking through the suffocating acceptance that had filled the room before. And then, through the fragments of sound, he registered a phrase from the background. Not from those who fought for him, but from the ones who had stepped aside. The words were heavy, final, spoken with the same detached certainty he had known all his life. He's a lost cause. The statement cut through the rhythm of compressions, through the command of medical voices, through the faint pulse of resistance in his chest. It was not just spoken, it was pronounced like a verdict, sealing the perception of who he was. But in that instant, something shifted. The words, intended as closure, instead sparked an unspoken defiance. Even in the near silence of his failing body, there was a flicker of rebellion, a refusal to let that judgment be the last word. Though he could not speak or move, some deeper part of him resisted the weight of that declaration. It was as if the void itself hesitated, unsure whether to claim him fully or release him back into the hands that fought so relentlessly. The line between life and death remained razor thin, but in the clash of resignation and persistence, a strange truth emerged. The family's words may have been intended as an ending, yet they became something else entirely. The beginning of a different kind of struggle, one no longer bound by their certainty. As the darkness pressed closer, it was no longer absolute. Against it pulsed the rhythm of determined hands, the echo of stubborn breaths forced into his lungs, and the faint possibility that their verdict might not be final. Chapter 3. The stubborn heart of the paramedic. She had stepped into countless homes and emergency scenes during her career, each with its own peculiar silence, its own unique chaos. But this room carried a heaviness that went beyond the failing body on the floor. The words she overheard, spoken by the family with resigned certainty, cut deeper than the stillness of the pulse she could not yet find. Lost cause. She had heard the phrase before, often from those who had given up before she even arrived. Yet this time something in her tightened. She paused only briefly, long enough for her eyes to flash with a mix of anger and defiance, then dropped to her knees with renewed force. Her palms pressed down against the sternum with steady rhythm, arms locked, shoulders driving the weight she had carried for years of training. Each compression sent a dull thud through her own bones, but she ignored the sting. She counted silently in her mind, matching the pace drilled into her during endless training exercises. Sweat began to form along her temples almost instantly, but the rhythm did not falter. Every downward push was more than technique. It was her refusal to let someone else's defeatist judgment dictate the outcome. Around her, the room hummed with tension. The family hovered in the background, their murmurs carrying the sound of surrender. They stood as spectators, not allies, their presence heavy with indifference. She felt their expectation pressing on her back like an additional weight, but it only fueled her further. She had seen despair steal lives faster than any arrhythmia, and she refused to let resignation be the last force in this space. Her hands became the metronome of defiance, pounding into the chest of a man others had already abandoned. Minutes dragged like hours. The human body, fragile yet stubborn, gave no sign of yielding. His chest rose and fell under her pressure, but the pulse she searched for remained elusive. Her muscles ached, yet she pushed harder, her entire frame focused on a single purpose. Each cycle of compressions and breaths blurred into the next. Her breathing grew ragged, but she kept her posture upright, refusing to betray any hint of doubt. In her mind, this was not a question of convenience or comfort. It was the thin line between silence and survival. The paramedic's partner prepared equipment, checking vitals, recording times, administering oxygen. Yet the true center of the battle remained her relentless rhythm. She tuned out the peripheral sounds, the family's sighs, the shuffle of feet, the faint creak of furniture, as if none of it mattered. Her world narrowed to the man beneath her hands and the beat she refused to let die. Even when the silence stretched on, even when the body showed no response, she pressed forward. She had been trained to recognize futility, but training had also taught her something else. Never stop until certainty replaces doubt. Her arms began to tremble with exertion. The burn of fatigue shot up from her wrists to her shoulders, but she welcomed it. Pain meant effort, and effort meant life still had a chance. She shifted slightly to maintain momentum, her knees digging into the floor, her body locked in determination. For every voice that whispered to stop, there was her own inner voice answering back with silence and action. She had long ago accepted that her profession demanded a willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of another's fragile chance. And in this moment, that principle consumed her entirely. The atmosphere thickened as the seconds became indistinguishable from minutes. She knew time was an enemy, but she treated each passing beat as if it were a challenge issued directly to her. She refused to surrender, refused to let the words of defeat hang unchallenged in the air. Every compression was a declaration that hope was not as easily extinguished as the family seemed to believe. The sound of her gloves brushing against fabric and the steady thump of her weight driving into the chest filled the space. The cadence was harsh, unrelenting, almost brutal, yet it was the only link keeping the man tethered to life. She saw nothing but his face, pale and slack, framed by shadows. Yet in that lifeless expression, she imagined the faintest possibility of return, and that possibility was enough. Her partner's updates came in clipped phrases, noting intervals and adjustments. She nodded briefly, never losing pace, never faltering. Her determination grew sharper with every cycle. She knew she was battling not only against the failure of the heart, but against the crushing weight of disbelief surrounding them. It was not just the patient who needed saving. It was the very notion that surrender could masquerade as love. She pressed on until the act itself became automatic, her body running on instinct long after exhaustion should have forced her to stop. Her heart hammered in her chest, her arms burned, her breath tore in short bursts. Yet she continued. The family's silence behind her spoke volumes, but she let it dissolve into the background. Her focus was absolute. In that unending stretch of minutes, she transformed the room. Where there had been defeat, there was now resistance. Where there had been resignation, there was persistence. Her hands, bruised and shaking, became the last force standing between a man's fading existence and the abyss. She carried not only her own strength, but the silent defiance of every patient she had ever refused to give up on. And in that relentless rhythm, she proved that sometimes hope survives not in miracles, but in the stubborn will of one pair of hands that refuses to let go. Chapter 4. The Return from the Abyss. At first there had been nothing, an endless, weightless silence, a place where sound and sensation ceased to exist. Time lost meaning in that emptiness, and it felt as though he had been drifting for centuries. Then, without warning, the void split apart. A searing flash of light tore through the darkness, as if some unseen force had driven a blade into the silence. The stillness shattered. His chest convulsed violently, air forcing itself into lungs that had been motionless. A ragged, broken sound escaped his throat, harsh and unsteady, but unmistakably alive. Pain followed immediately, sharp and undeniable. His chest burned with the echo of compressions, every rib aching under the memory of relentless pressure. His limbs trembled uncontrollably, as though his body could not yet decide if it was prepared to exist again. The sensation of breath entering and leaving his lungs felt foreign, almost intrusive, yet it anchored him firmly in the realm he had nearly left behind. The first desperate inhalation brought with it both fire and relief, a reminder of how fragile the boundary between silence and life truly was. The paramedic leaned over him, her figure framed against the chaos of the room. Her eyes, once hard with determination, now carried something else, relief mingled with unyielding resolve. She had fought for this moment, refused to abandon the effort, and the faint rise of his chest was her victory. Her hands, still poised and trembling with exhaustion, hovered near his body as if ready to resume should the fragile rhythm falter again. For her, this was not chance or miracle alone, but the result of unwavering will. Behind her, the family reacted with a stunned recoil. Their bodies shifted backward, their eyes widening not with joy, but with disbelief. They had expected finality, had already resigned themselves to the outcome, and now reality betrayed their assumptions. The verdict they had pronounced so casually dissolved in the face of undeniable life. Their earlier words, spoken with cold certainty, lost their authority in an instant. The pulse that now beat beneath his skin refuted every syllable of defeat they had offered. He felt the weight of their disbelief, yet it no longer pierced him as it once had. In that fragile moment between life and death, he discovered something powerful. The strength that had pulled him back had not come from those who shared his blood, but from a stranger who refused to yield. It was not familial loyalty that restored breath to his lungs, but the relentless hands of someone who believed that even the faintest chance was worth fighting for. The contrast was undeniable, and it struck him more deeply than the pain in his ribs. Every sensation sharpened as his consciousness reasserted itself. The cold floor beneath him grounded his body, the sterile scent of antiseptic filled his nose, and the rough oxygen forcing its way through the mask tightened across his face. Machines beeped faintly in the distance, registering signs that had moments before been absent. The sharp sting of returning awareness was overwhelming, but it carried with it the knowledge that he was still here. Each beat of his heart was a defiance, each gasp of breath a quiet declaration that he had not been erased. The paramedic's expression softened briefly as she observed him struggling to breathe on his own. Relief flickered across her face, but beneath it remained vigilance. She did not allow herself the luxury of full triumph. She knew how fragile life remained in these moments, how easily the body could slip back into silence. Yet for him, that flicker of relief was enough. It was the first genuine recognition of his existence he had felt in longer than he could remember. In her gaze, there was no disappointment, no resignation, only acknowledgement that his fight had value. The family lingered nearby, their posture stiff, their faces betraying uncertainty. They had no words now, no pronouncements to offer, for the living pulse before them had undone their narrative. Their silence was heavy, but unlike before, it no longer defined him. The weight of their judgment had been broken by the rhythm of another's determination. He realized that their belief in his hopelessness could no longer hold the same power. He had returned without their help, and in doing so, had stripped their words of their hold over him. As he lay trembling, each breath shallow but steady, a clarity emerged. Survival had not been gifted by the family who had already buried him in their minds. It had been wrenched back through the sheer refusal of one woman to accept what others had declared. In that understanding lay a profound truth. Sometimes, the greatest lifeline comes not from those expected to love unconditionally, but from a stranger who sees worth where others see none. The pain still roared through his body, but beneath it pulsed something stronger. He had returned from the abyss, tethered to life not by hope given to him, but by hope fought for on his behalf. The realization was both humbling and empowering. He lived, not because his family believed he could, but because someone else chose to believe in the possibility that he should. And as the oxygen filled his lungs again and again, he understood that this return marked more than survival. It marked the beginning of a life no longer bound by the verdict of hopelessness that had once defined him. Chapter 5. The silence after the storm. The days in the hospital blurred together, marked by the steady rhythm of machines and the muted shuffle of nurses' shoes across polished floors. He lay in a bed surrounded by pale curtains and sterile light, slowly piecing his strength back together from the fragments left after the collapse. His body felt heavy, weighed down by bruises from the compressions and the lingering ache of a heart that had failed him. Each breath carried both relief and soreness, a constant reminder of the razor-thin line he had walked. The doctors reminded him often of how rare his survival had been, pointing out that only the immediacy and persistence of resuscitation had doubled or even tripled his chance to remain alive. Their words carried the tone of miracle and science blended into one, and he listened with quiet gratitude, though he also heard the unspoken truth. He was never meant to return, and yet here he was. The room filled with the quiet monotony of recovery. Blood pressure checks, temperature readings, and careful observations became his new schedule. The fluorescent lights above him remained constant, a substitute sun that never truly dimmed. The silence between these routines was both comforting and unsettling. It gave him time to think, time to remember, and time to feel the hollow presence of family members who came and went like shadows. Their visits, brief and strained, lacked the warmth that should have accompanied them. They appeared more out of duty than out of desire, their steps cautious, their voices subdued, as if they feared confronting what their words had meant on the day he fell. His mother sat at the edge of the bed once, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. She avoided his eyes as if looking directly at him would expose her own silent betrayal. She spoke little, muttering about errands and obligations, her sentences trailing into silence before she quickly excused herself. His father tried to fill the void with talk of ordinary matters, repairs that needed doing at the house, weather forecasts, the cost of groceries. The subjects were safe, small, and entirely disconnected from the enormity of what had happened. They were walls built of words, constructed to avoid acknowledgement of the moment they had pronounced him lost. His sister visited briefly, carrying a strained brightness in her tone, pretending all was well, pretending nothing had fractured between them. Yet beneath her false cheer, he sensed unease, a discomfort that lingered in every pause. Between them and him, a wall had risen, invisible, yet impenetrable. He could feel it in the silence that filled the room after they left, in the absence of genuine relief or joy in their faces. They knew, as he did, that when the moment had come, they had surrendered him to death with their resignation. Their eyes carried the knowledge that they had already buried him in their hearts before his body had returned. And he, lying in the fragile space between life regained and trust broken, understood that his return was not a celebration for them, but an unexpected inconvenience to their certainty. The only presence that pierced this atmosphere of strained avoidance came from the paramedic who sometimes stepped quietly into his room. Her visits were brief, often under the pretense of checking his progress or speaking with the nurses, but her gaze met his without hesitation. There was no shame in her eyes, no discomfort in acknowledging what had occurred. Instead, her look carried a quiet steadiness, an unspoken reminder that his survival had not been an accident. She bore the marks of exhaustion still, a faint heaviness in her posture, but she also carried the assurance of someone who had refused to let go. For him, her presence was a lifeline that stretched beyond the physical, proof that belief, when unyielding, could be more powerful than resignation. As the days passed, he listened to the sounds of the ward, the distant beeping of monitors, the occasional cries of other patients, the low voices of staff moving through their shifts. These noises became the background music to his recovery, replacing the silence of the abyss with a fragile symphony of life continuing. At night, when the corridors grew still, he lay awake, replaying the moments he remembered. He thought of the compressions that had pounded against his chest, of the words spoken by those meant to protect him, of the hands that had refused to stop. The contrast between surrender and defiance sharpened with each memory, and the truth settled heavily within him. He realized that he could no longer measure his worth by the approval of his family. Their visits only reinforced what he already knew, that his existence had been more burden than blessing in their eyes. Yet the determination of a stranger had rewritten that narrative, had returned him from the edge when those closest to him had already turned away. That knowledge was painful, yet liberating. He owed his life not to blood ties, but to persistence born of conviction. In the hospital's sterile quiet, surrounded by walls that heard every sigh and caught every whispered footstep, he discovered a strange peace. The storm had passed, leaving behind not celebration, but an emptiness that revealed truth. He was alive, scarred but breathing, and in the silence after the chaos, he found clarity. His family's presence no longer defined him. Their resignation no longer chained him. What defined him now was the heartbeat that had returned despite them, and the steady gaze of one who had refused to surrender him to darkness. Chapter 6. A new meaning to breath. When he finally stepped out of the hospital doors, the air felt heavier, richer, carrying with it a sharpness that made every inhale sting with life. The world outside looked unchanged, yet to him it had been remade. The trees lining the walkway swayed gently, their branches creaking in the wind, and each movement seemed more deliberate than before. The sunlight struck his skin not as an afterthought, but as a reminder that he had returned from a place where no warmth existed. He paused for a long moment, steadying himself, feeling the weight of his own heartbeat inside his chest. That pulse, fragile yet undeniable, no longer belonged to the family who had abandoned hope, but to him, reclaimed by the will of another who had refused to give up. His family remained as they had always been, trapped in the narrow corridors of their own beliefs. They visited briefly after his release, offering small gestures, half smiles, and the same shallow conversations about weather and trivial matters. Yet their presence no longer held the power it once had. The need to please them, to fight endlessly for their recognition, had dissolved in the sterile halls of the hospital. He understood now that he owed them nothing. His survival had not been born from their faith, but from their indifference. What had pulled him back was not blood, but determination that came from elsewhere, from hands that pressed against his chest when everyone else had turned away. Every beat of his heart carried defiance. Each breath was a refusal of their verdict, a declaration that he was more than the hopeless case they had proclaimed him to be. That knowledge became both weight and freedom. For years his life had been measured against the silent scale of their judgment, but the collapse had stripped that away. He no longer needed their acknowledgement. He was alive in spite of it, and that made each inhalation more than just survival. It made it meaning. The days following his release were slow and uncertain. His body remained weak, recovering from the trauma. But his spirit had found a focus sharper than ever before. He read about survival statistics, about the small percentage who walked away from sudden cardiac arrest, and realized just how narrow the margin had been. The numbers made his existence feel like a borrowed gift, one that demanded responsibility. He began searching for ways to honor it, to carry forward the lesson etched into him during those endless minutes of compressions. It was not long before he found the path. An organization dedicated to teaching first aid and resuscitation accepted his offer to volunteer. The first day he walked into their training hall, he felt the same nervousness that had followed him into every family gathering where judgment loomed. But here, no one measured him by past failures or fragile health. They saw him as a survivor, someone who carried a story that could reach others in ways no textbook could. Standing before a group of strangers, he placed a training mannequin on the table and felt his pulse quicken. not from fear, but from recognition. He showed them the rhythm, the downward press of hands, the steadiness that could mean the difference between silence and return. With each demonstration, his memory slipped back to that moment, to the compressions that had pounded life back into him, while words of resignation hung in the air. He told no dramatic tales, yet his movements carried conviction. When he pressed his palms against the mannequin, he felt again the invisible thread that had pulled him back. He repeated the cadence, steady and relentless, and with each cycle reminded himself and his audience that persistence mattered more than certainty. As weeks passed, teaching became more than duty. It became purpose. He saw the way people listened, their expressions shifting as they realized the weight of what he showed them. He imagined each of them someday standing over someone else, hearing the same silence, feeling the same urgency, and choosing, as she had chosen, not to stop. That vision gave his life a clarity he had never known. He could not rewrite the words spoken by his family, but he could ensure that others carried forward a different message. Sometimes, late at night, he would recall the phrase that had defined him for so long. He's a lost cause. It no longer cut into him as a wound. Instead, it served as fuel. He repeated it silently as he pressed his hands down during practice, answering it with every compression. To him, it became a vow that as long as there was even the faintest chance, there would be no surrender. Breath had taken on a new meaning. It was no longer the simple act of surviving, but the symbol of defiance, resilience, and renewal. Each inhale was proof that despair could be wrong. Each exhale a reminder that even the weakest body could carry strength when bolstered by determination. His life had been returned not as a gift, but as a challenge, one he accepted each time he taught another person how to fight for a heartbeat. And so the silence that once defined him gave way to rhythm, the rhythm of lungs drawing air, the rhythm of hands pressing down, the rhythm of a heart that continued to beat in spite of everything. In that rhythm, he found the truest meaning of existence. Not to wait for recognition, not to beg for love, but to breathe with purpose and to give others the chance to do the same.